It is easy to convince the oppressed that their oppression is not in their interest. That is obvious. The more difficult part is convincing the oppressor that oppression is not in their interest. The reality is not always easily communicated, particularly if it clashes with simple intuition. Convincing the oppressor that oppression does not serve their interests is far more important than anything else. By definition, the oppressor has control. By definition, the oppressor has disproportionate power. By definition, the oppressor is in the best position to end oppression. And only by making such a case can one give progressive movements a mark of righteous superiority, a mark of universal desirability. White supremacy serves the interests of whites. Patriarchy serves the interests of men. Such claims have implications pertaining to self-interest that serve to give undue legitimacy to systems of oppression. It should never be assumed that oppression is in the interest of the oppressor. This is a falsity. This falsity provides a justification for oppression. This falsity gives undue legitimacy to oppression. This falsity makes the fight against oppression a cynical power play instead of a righteous struggle. Leftist politics is not a cynical, egoistic power play. Leftist politics is a righteous movement, and it is time for us to own that reality. Such misguided claims about self-interest give undue legitimacy to oppression, and distort leftist politics into a cynical, egoistic power play, as opposed to a righteous movement. We cannot accept the right-wing notion that politics is all about zero-sum power plays, where a win for one group is a loss for another. The idea that dominant classes benefit from oppression is rancid. It provides oppression with legitimacy and makes left-wing politics into a cynical, egoistic power play, where every marginalized person would be an oppressor if only their fortunes were different. The reality is that we are a righteous movement. The challenge is effectively communicating this, for even many leftists do not understand it. No sentient being benefits from undermined respect for sentience. No being who can suffer benefits from the normalization of cruelty and brutality. No being who can suffer benefits from a society that is desensitized to human suffering. No being who can suffer benefits from the corrosion of empathy and compassion. Oppression threatens the fundamental interests of all by creating a state of normalized suffering. We are sentient beings first and foremost. We are, on our most fundamental level, sentient beings. A society that is opposed to suffering is in the interest of one who can suffer. This maxim identifies our fundamental interests as sentient beings. A state of normalized suffering, a desensitized society, a cruel and brutal world, a land devoid of empathy and compassion. This is contrary to the fundamental interests of one who can suffer. This is contrary to the fundamental interests of all sentient beings, be they the oppressed or the oppressor. Oppression endangers the fundamental interests of all, and so is born the universal necessity of destroying oppression. Such a move would advance the fundamental interests of all. A society that is opposed to suffering is in the interest of all who can suffer. A society that absolutely despises suffering is in the interest of all who can suffer. Normalized suffering threatens the fundamental interests of all who can suffer. Normalized cruelty threatens the fundamental interests of all who can suffer. The oppression of one eases the oppression of all. Oppression normalizes oppression. The oppression of one is a threat to the well-being of all. We are precedent-based creatures. Every action establishes a precedent that will inform the behavior of others. Our actions write the guidelines that others will live by. Be careful what precedent you establish, reinforce, or undermine. To make another suffer in pursuit of one's own interest, This is the precedent established by oppression. This precedent will inform the behaviour of others. This precedent will endanger the well-being of all. We are social beings, and social existence is greatly enriched by the capacity for immense empathy and massive compassion. These capacities are crucial to an optimal existence as a social creature. One would be wise to maintain and improve these capacities. Caring for the well-being of others is one path towards such a thing. The fight against oppression is not a cynical conflict of interests. The fight against oppression advances the interests of all. The fight against oppression is a rational imperative that possesses a universal justification and absolute legitimacy. The fight against oppression is a righteous moral struggle. Let us march forward with all the righteous determination in the world.